November 9th, coming to you live from Seoul. We start with the stories making the headlines at this hour. Israeli forces say Hamas has lost control of northern Gaza, where Israel continues targeting Hamas's tunnels. Meanwhile, Israel says it has no plans to reoccupy Gaza after the war, as the U.S. once again warns against Israel's reoccupation. President Yoon will be heading to San Francisco next week to attend the APEC summit. On the sidelines, the South Korean president and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida are expected to give a joint lecture at Stanford University. More trips to Europe are also scheduled. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in South Korea. He's set to meet with his South Korean counterpart Park Jin and President Yoon Suk-yeol, with Russia and North Korea's arms cooperation among the topics to be discussed. Israel forces say Hamas has lost control of northern Gaza, prompting thousands of Palestinians to flee. As they press on with their offensive targeting Hamas's tunnels, the U.S. continues to seek a humanitarian pause for hostages to be released. Lee Seung-jae has more.
According to Israel's military spokesperson, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, during a televised briefing on Wednesday, Hamas has lost control of northern Gaza as thousands of Gazans have moved south. The spokesperson said some 50,000 Palestinians moved from the northern Gaza Strip to the south, adding that they're moving because they understand that Hamas has lost control in the north. While Hagari reiterated the government's stance that there will be no ceasefire, he said Israel has been allowing humanitarian pauses at specific times to allow Gazans to relocate south. In a press release also on Wednesday, the Israel Defense Forces claimed it had destroyed 130 Hamas tunnel shafts as it continues with its air and ground operations in Gaza. According to the statement, combat engineers fighting in Gaza are destroying Hamas's weapons and are locating, exposing, and detonating tunnel shafts. Meanwhile, the U.S. is closely discussing with Israel and Qatar a proposal for a pause in fighting in Gaza of up to 3 days, which will allow the delivery of more humanitarian aid and the possible release of some hostages held by Hamas. While Israel has made it clear that a humanitarian ceasefire would only come if the Palestinian militant group releases all 240 hostages, a senior Arab source familiar with the discussions said there was hope that a deal could still be reached, adding that the parties involved are at a critical stage of the negotiations. A diplomat briefed on the matter said that a pause of 1 to 3 days could allow the release of 10 to 15 hostages and also give Hamas time to gather information of the identities and locations of all the hostages in order to secure the release of dozens more. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, there is growing attention on who will govern Gaza after the war. Israel says it has no plans to reoccupy Gaza as the U.S. once again warns against Israel's reoccupation. Our Choi Soo-hyung reports.
The U.S. State Secretary Antony Blinken on Wednesday local time said that Gaza cannot be occupied by Israel again. At a news conference after his G7 foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo, he also added that it's clear that authority over the governance of the Gaza Strip should be run by Palestine residents.
When it comes to post-conflict governance in Gaza, a few things are clear and necessary. One, Gaza cannot be continue to be run by Hamas. That simply invites a repetition of October 7th, and Gaza used as a place from which to launch terrorist attacks. It's also clear that Israel cannot occupy Gaza.
On Tuesday, Washington once again warned against Israel's reoccupation of Gaza following Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments that Israel will have indefinite overall security responsibility for the Gaza Strip. U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby also said it's quite possible for the Israeli military to remain in the Gaza Strip for a while after the war for follow-up measures, but the U.S. is firmly against a long-term reoccupation. On the same day, Reuters reported that Israel has no plans to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. An unnamed senior Israeli official stated that Israel has no intention of reoccupying or governing Gaza for an extended period. Furthermore, Israel emphasized that the ongoing operations in the Gaza Strip are effective and will continue, and they are not open-ended. Israel clarified that its military involvement is aimed at dismantling Hamas's terrorism and threats, but even after the military operations are complete, there will be a need for gradual measures against Hamas infrastructure. The Israeli government also said it's too early to talk about the next step scenarios for governance of the Gaza Strip, and their current operation is focusing on completely eradicating Hamas. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News.
President Yoon will be heading to San Francisco next week to attend the APEC summit. There he is expected to give a joint lecture with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at Stanford University. More trips to Europe are also scheduled. Our top office correspondent Oh Soo-young has the details.
President Yoon aims to increase host economic security and high-tech partnerships with like-minded countries, engaging in multilateral summitry in the United States and state visits to Europe. Yoon's office on Wednesday announced the President and the First Lady's upcoming trips, starting with the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Arriving in San Francisco on November 15th, Yoon will attend the official APEC sessions from the next day, laying out South Korea's role in global cooperation to make the green transition and support countries vulnerable to climate change. He'll also emphasize the need for multilateral efforts to strengthen supply chains and establish digital ethical standards amid the rapid evolution of artificial intelligence. The leader will also hold bilateral talks on the sidelines and engage with the local Korean community, as well as young people in high-tech industries. Japanese media reported that Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida are likely to hold a summit, with their officers currently in talks to arrange a joint lecture by the leaders at Stanford University. After returning to Seoul for the weekend, the first couple will head to London for a state visit, the first to be extended by King Charles III upon 140 years of bilateral relations. On November 21st, Yoon will attend official royal engagements, observing a guard of honour and a carriage progression to Buckingham Palace to meet King Charles at a welcoming ceremony and luncheon. The South Korean leader will then pay his respects to Korean war veterans and at the Tomb of the Unknown at Westminster Abbey before delivering a speech at Parliament to set out the future of bilateral ties. Heading to number 10 Downing Street the next day, Yoon will hold a summit with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak as the two sides produce the South Korea-UK Accord. They will set out to strengthen their strategic partnership in trade, IT, cybersecurity, weapons, space and green industries, among other key areas. Crossing over the English Channel to France, Yoon will continue his appeal for South Korea's coastal city of Busan to host the 2030 World Expo ahead of the decisive vote by member countries later this month in Paris. Marking his final overseas diplomacy of the year, Yoon will head to the Netherlands in mid-December, marking his first state visit to the country by a South Korean leader. During his two-day stay, he's expected to engage with the Dutch royal family, government at The Hague, as well as key businesses in high-tech areas.
President Yoon's diplomatic streak comes against the backdrop of the growing US-China rivalry, the ongoing war in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas conflict, making his multilateral engagements all the more crucial amid efforts for global and economic security as Seoul looks to act as a global pivotal state.
The APEC summit will be a chance to strengthen South Korea's diplomacy as a responsible player in the global community, while the state visit to the UK aims to strengthen strategic cooperation, particularly with key friendly nations. President Yoon has assigned Seoul with the responsibility and role of contributing to world freedom, peace and prosperity whilst attending the NATO, ASEAN and G20 summits and the UN General Assembly earlier this year.
Yoon has held over 140 summits so far this year, with at least 93 nations, according to the top office. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in South Korea. This comes at a time when North Korea and Russia appear to be deepening military ties. He arrived at the Ulsan Air Base at around 9:30 p.m. on Wednesday after taking part in a G7 foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo. Later on Thursday, the top U.S. diplomat is scheduled to meet with President Yoon and hold a meeting with his South Korean counterpart, Park Jin. Measures to prevent further North Korean arms cooperation with Russia is expected to top the agenda, as well as ways to strengthen security and economic cooperation between Seoul and Washington. This is the first time in more than two and a half years that Blinken has visited Seoul. The latest report by the Korea Development Institute gave mixed prospects for South Korea's economy and that it sees both recovery and challenges. Against this backdrop, the KDI will announce its economic outlook for the second half of the year today. To discuss its latest assessment, we're joined by Lee Seo-hyun, assistant professor from KDI School of Public Policy Management. Welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning.
Well, Professor, again, the latest prospect for September was mixed. Well, let's first talk about the optimistic side. What was the major factor you would say leading to the economic recovery?
Yes, indeed, various economic indicators are showing some signs of recovery. Industrial production year-over-year growth rate was up by 1.5 percentage point, led by semiconductor sector and as well as primary metals. The service sector has shown modest growth supported by the tourism sector that is gradually returning to normal after the COVID pandemic. And the construction sector remains strong in terms of the value of construction completed. And looking at the external sector as well, the latest trade data indicate improving signs of export. In October, export actually rose for the first time in 13 months as export to the U.S. rose.
Well, the KDI has been noting signs of recovery for the past few months now. It seems like the latest report has enhanced that view. Would you say that the country has hit its lowest point and that its recovery is picking up pace?
Yes, as a technology cycle is expected to turn the corner, the growth is likely to improve in the second half of the year. In the medium term as well, the real GDP growth will be just over 2%, and the recovery appears relatively resilient. And the risk to the economic outlook actually tilted to the downside, but compared to a couple of months ago, it is more balanced.
Well, despite all this, the report did maintain the stance that the country faces external uncertainties, as you have mentioned just now. What kind of challenges are we talking about exactly here?
One of the key downside risks is more persistent global inflation and the need to tighten monetary policy further for many of the advanced economies as well as South Korea. Global interest rate could remain higher for longer, and this may have implications for South Korean financial stability, especially with a very high level of household debt among, housing market downturn. And also there's another factor that could actually affect the, economic outlook, which is a weaker boost from China's economy due to a deeper downturn in the property sector in China. China remains as one of the biggest trade partner with South Korea, so it may have some implications for South Korean economic growth in the, short term and medium term. Apart from this, we have also very heightened geopolitical risks, and its impact on the oil prices and supply chain could also impact South Korean economic recovery in the negative way.
Okay, now amid the good and bad aspects, the KDI is set to release its economic outlook for the second half of the year later today. What are we expecting?
I think as we have discussed just now, we have seen a lot of positive signs of recovery, in September and in October. So I think growth is likely to improve in the second half of the year, and we could expect some of this message from KDI as well. However, the economic outlook is, as we discussed, subject to high degree of uncertainty stemming from external sector. So I think, going forward, restrictive stance for monetary and fiscal policy in Korea to counter, the high inflation, that would also be needed for the remaining, once we see some sign of, reduction in the inflation.
All right, Professor, thank you for your insight today.
Okay, thank you.
Unionized workers of Seoul Metro, the operator of Seoul subway lines 1 to 9, began a 2-day strike on Thursday with reduced service provided outside of rush hour. The unionized workers are on strike from Thursday at 9 a.m. until Friday at 6 p.m. to protest the company's manpower reduction plan. The strike comes as Seoul Metro's management and the union failed to reach a deal during last-minute talks on Wednesday. Talks were suspended just 2 minutes into the meeting, which was followed by an announcement that the two sides had failed to reach a deal. South Korea's biggest startup festival, Comeup 2023, is underway. More than half the participating startups came from overseas, providing a networking platform for domestic startups seeking to go global. Our Lee Soo-jin has more.
South Korea is ready for its startups to make their mark. The country's biggest startup festival, Comeup 2023, which will be held across 3 days, kicked off on Wednesday under the slogan, "We Move the World." Now in its 5th year, Comeup, hosted by the Ministry of SMEs and Startups, is focusing on helping startups expand into global markets and providing them with various business opportunities. For the first time ever, most of the participating startups, 60% in fact, are from overseas. Continuing the global networking drive that began with President Yoon's state visit to the Middle East, global startups from 35 countries will be in attendance, including a 180-member delegation from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. To accommodate them all, there's a separate global zone set up, a new addition for this year. It stages company booths and country pavilions allow domestic startups to network and pitch to companies and officials from across the world. This year's Comeup also features select local startups from various stages of development, giving them a platform to showcase their products. The festival also provides them with various opportunities for mentorship, networking, and investment. Arirang News sat down with the Minister of SMEs and Startups. She told us that this festival will highlight the strengths of South Korean startups.
South Korean startups are being recognized for their superior technology. For instance, in this year's CES, a quarter of the Innovation Award honorees were South Korean startups. In a digital era when new technology and businesses are needed, South Korean startups are already garnering much attention.
Also, this year's festival provides opportunities for startups to win what they need the most: capital.
At this year's Comeup, there are 160 venture capitals from both Korea and abroad in attendance.
The minister added that she hopes that this festival will pave the way for more local startups to expand their business internationally, which will also help avoid business competition in the domestic market. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Kim Seong, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. We begin in the U.S., where on Tuesday, voters headed to the polls to decide state initiatives and referendums during off-year elections. The night delivered some historic wins, including a pro-choice victory in Ohio. Ohio voters approved a constitutional amendment that will enshrine access to abortion in state law. Indonesia's only race to include abortion on the ballot, it became the 7th state to guarantee abortion access, considered a considerable victory since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last year. And Ohio also became the 24th state in the U.S. to legalize marijuana for recreational use. The results, which also include Virginia's Democratic governor staying in office, as well as the Democrats taking full control of Kentucky's State House, are good news for Democrats amid poor approval numbers for President Joe Biden. Now moving over to Asia, where Malaysia's leader, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, told Parliament on Tuesday that Malaysians should unanimously back the Palestine cause, including maintaining ties with the militant group Hamas. On Tuesday, parliamentary session, the Prime Minister's reaffirmation of his support for Palestine came as a response to a proposal by the U.S. to sanction Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad's foreign supporters. He also urged media outlets to avoid describing Hamas fighters as militants, saying Hamas holds the same values as Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, which fought against apartheid in South Africa. Malaysia, a Muslim-majority nation, does not recognize Israel as a country and has maintained the position that no diplomatic relations will commence until a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine is secured. Staying in Asia and to Indonesia, where former Communication and Information Technology Minister Johnny G. Plate has been sentenced to 15 years by the country's anti-graft court on Wednesday. The former cabinet minister was found guilty of corruption linked to the construction of mobile and internet transmission towers in rural parts of Indonesia. He was fined around $64,000 and ordered to reimburse the country for its losses to the tune of around $1 million. Prosecutors alleged that from a $533 million procurement project, the ex-minister pocketed around $1.2 million by turning a blind eye to feasibility studies on construction sites. Plate is the 5th former minister from President Joko Widodo's administration to have been sentenced for corruption. King Charles III, Britain's reigning monarch, got a taste of Korea as he visited Europe's largest Koreatown on Wednesday. In the first official visit by a royal member of the royal family, the visit follows a special mention of Korean President Yoon's state visit in the King's speech on Tuesday. Home to the largest population of Koreans in Europe, New Malden residents prepared a celebration of Korean food and culture, including traditional attire, hanbok, as well as putting on performances for the king. Year 2023 marks the 140th years of bilateral relations between the two nations.
Good morning. The early winter chill is taking a short break today before returning with colder air tomorrow. Morning temperatures are 3 to 5 degrees higher than yesterday in most places, with warmer highs today. Then sub-zero morning temperatures await us this weekend. As much as we wish we could enjoy today's warm temperatures, perhaps the warmest we'll have in a while, it's going to be rather cloudy with rain. Rain starts from central regions this afternoon, gradually spreading to the southern parts of the country and Jeju Island by tonight. Jeju could see up to 50 millimeters. The rest of the country could see 5 to 30 millimeters into Friday. Meanwhile, those in Gyeongsangdo provinces and surrounding areas could enjoy sunnier skies during the day, so please do so if you can, with highs going into the 20s this afternoon. Meanwhile, Seoul tops out at 17 degrees this afternoon. Looking ahead to next week, don't worry, we are not skipping right into the winter. Things will warm up by the middle of next week. Well, that's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That is all for today. Thanks for watching.
Welcome. (24시간) 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라 감당할 수 있겠니? Welcome. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라 감당할 수 있겠니? 한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라 감당할 수 있겠니?
Busan, Korea is already reaching the entire world, like ocean waves that travel far and wide. It's Busan, the perfect World Expo city, transforming our world, navigating toward a better future. Welcome. (24시간) 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라 감당할 수 있겠니? 한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라 감당할 수 있겠니? 하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, who's lying? Make sure you listen to what I say. I'm Maybe stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
We're here to make a new type of news. New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's November 9th here in Seoul, and I'm Yoon, and you're watching News Generation. Joining me in the studio is Nal Song. Good morning. And Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. The Italian government has granted citizenship to a critically ill 8-month-old baby born in the UK named Indy Gregory. The baby has been suffering from mitochondrial disease and is in the center of a legal battle, with English doctors arguing it's no longer in her best interest to continue life support measures. But the Italian decision has added weight to the parents' efforts to take Gregory to a Vatican hospital and treat her for what's seen as an incurable disease. And contrary to South Korea, which has kicked off its winter season with a drop in temperatures, Japan is seeing an all-time high for November. On Tuesday, Tokyo's afternoon highs reached 27.5 degrees Celsius. That's the highest for November the city has seen in 100 years. Japan's Meteorological Administration classifies temperatures passing 25 degrees as summer days, but for the past few days this month, Tokyo has had summer-like afternoons. And moving on to our last story, if you're single, ready to mingle, and in Korea, try considering a temple stay session set for November 18th to 19th. The Korean Buddhist Foundation for Social Welfare will be hosting a special temple stay program for singles in their 20s and 30s to meet their significant other. Applications are open till November 13th, and a total of 10 slots per gender are open. Now, this program is free of charge, and the main objective is to help singles who feel lonely find a potential partner. Also, to engage in a healthy interaction at a serene place like the temple. This program is being sponsored by the Health Ministry, which has actively been trying to boost marriage and birth rates here in Korea. So here at the studio, I'm quite curious, though you two are married, what do you guys think about this type of program?
Well, I guess like many people do complain these days that it's hard to find somebody, and especially when a lot of people are busy or everyone has different lifestyles these days, that, you know, these sort of programs are great and very helpful for, you know, singles out there who want to, you know, find somebody, which is great. However, it's interesting that it is held by the Korean Buddhist Foundation for Social Welfare, because I never thought about, well, since being a person who doesn't follow religion, I've never thought about religion actually setting up these sort of things. And though 10 spots per gender is open, that's not, I don't think that's a lot. I thought it was going to be like this big rave of people. And that's the thing. I've heard, and I've got friends who have gone to those sort of like single mingle parties that they go. It's either has a theme, like a wine theme or a coffee theme, and they get to know each other. And to me, I wouldn't want to go to those because it seems like there is a lot of attention on usually one person. Like everyone usually likes one person, so everyone goes to one person, makes everyone feel left out. And I hate competing against other people in that sort of situation.
It's so realistic.
It's so realistic. But
you really thought it out.
I've really thought it out. I wouldn't do it even if I was single, I don't think. It's not my style. But I was wondering, like, do you think Buddhists, they have to be Buddhists to get in because it's at a Buddhist temple?
Actually, applications are open for anyone who's single, who's ready to mingle. You don't need to have a religion.
I just want to add on to that. I just feel like Buddhism itself is just a religion that's a lot more open to other beliefs. And I mean, they sing Christmas carols during Christmas, so they're really open to that. But like you said, I thought this was so interesting that they take place at a temple where you're supposed to kind of empty of all your desires and find your inner peace. But then the opposite of that is finding your right person, and it's all about tension and romance. So I thought it was interesting, but it's fun that it's being sponsored by the health ministry.
For sure.
And there have been other efforts by regional governments in doing this matchmaking event. And I heard they're really popular and competitive to get into.
Exactly.
And I guess if you share the same values, a religious place is a great place to run into your partners. I met my husband at a church, so it works out.
A church or a temple.
Yeah, share the values.
And I think officials are doing a good job in reading our generation's trend. I think our dating trend, as we mentioned a few times on our show, has to do with naturally wanting to meet our significant other. So we call it chamanchu in Korean, right? So they're reading into this trend and making like the atmosphere for singles who are ready to mingle get to know each other, whether that be at a church or a temple or at...
Maybe it'll raise the birth rate a little bit.
Maybe it all adds up. Now, until then, that was our news feed for this Thursday. Let's switch gears to our main discussion topic of the day. South Korea definitely has a medical personnel problem. According to the health ministry, the number of doctors for every 1,000 people in Korea is only at 2.6, and this is much lower than the average of 3.7 among other OECD member countries. And officials have been trying to boost the number of physicians available. How? My AI voice will explain.
Last month, South Korea's health minister said the country will gradually increase its medical school enrollment quota in 2025, starting at existing medical schools. Officials are also thinking of opening up new medical schools in provincial areas. This is all to solve the chronic problem of there not being enough physicians. That's particularly a problem in rural areas outside of the capital, as South Korea is set to become a super-age society in less than 2 years. Officials are pointing to expanding its med school quota to better brace itself to have enough doctors for its growing senior citizen population.
Whether expanding the medical school quota is appropriate or not is a contentious issue here in South Korea. So why don't we start here with how this issue first came up?
Right. So the Korean government announced that the quota expansion for medical students will start in 2025. And starting in 2026, the efforts to strategically actually expand the quota will be set in motion. They're going to evaluate and renew many university hospital facilities. And overall, this process will actually increase more than 2/3 of the medical student numbers. And hopefully that'll see a good change in the future.
Right. Yes. And as a result of this potential expansion, the government was also expecting a negative reaction as well, that many doctors, current doctors, will and have gone to the streets to protest this possible expansion, which they've done possibly on a weekly basis, So many of the doctors who are publicly against this hike have expressed to the current administration that it's better that they actually focus on other measures to increase certain types of physicians, or that they're lacking in certain fields rather than just expanding it in general. So doctors also stress that increasing the quota could affect the quality of training and education that is needed in such a specialized field. Meaning, if you are able to, open up the field to, let's say, the quota that they are expecting, there could be students who didn't study as hard, and this is a field that we need to really be concentrating on.
I kind of want to add on to that, to play the devil's advocate a little bit. There's a lot of brilliant students in Korea who probably just barely missed the mark because it's so competitive to get into medical school. But not just getting in, going through medical school itself is so difficult. And then you have to go through residency if you really want to specialize in certain areas. So just because we expand the number of people getting accepted doesn't necessarily mean that there will be more doctors per se. And so I guess it could mean that the quality of education or people in their skills could drop, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
Right, and that's, as you guys both mentioned, there's a lot of surrounding arguments to this issue, but this issue first arose because the country is preparing to enter a super age society in less than 2 years' time. And what I mean by a super age society is that when 20% of the population is age 65 and up, that's a super age society. And with an aging population, we definitely need more doctors. And now, I briefly mentioned it before we saw the introductory VCR, but South Korea does does have a shortage in physicians, right?
Yeah, as you mentioned, we are a quickly aging society, and this is a way to prepare for the future. And this whole issue of expansion came up as the number of admission for medical schools has been frozen since 2006 at 3,058 students per year in the country. So as you can see on the screen, this is actually the number of clinical pathologists per 1,000 people in each country. In Mexico, it's 2.5 doctors per 1,000.
Yeah.
South Korea goes right after that. It's 2.6 per 1,000 people. USA is 2.7. UK at 3.2. Sweden is up at 4.3. And Austria is doing well at 5.4 doctors per 1,000 people. And so this makes the OECD average 3.7. But Korea is actually pretty low and well below the OECD average. So this causes a little bit of a concern.
Right.
And even amongst the doctors, most prefer to be a dermatologist or a plastic surgeon, as you can make a lot of money and there seems to be a better work-life balance, as you're not constantly on call and just there's no night or day shift, you know? This is putting necessary medical areas at a critical risk.
This is a critical issue. We're seeing a lot of physicians short in rural areas or in certain departments that are critical in need. But at the same time, can you blame them? You go through years of practice.
Hard.
And you obviously want to go for a high-paying job because it does have to do with your livelihood. Now, Walter, why don't we expand on that angle of this story? I think the matter of the issue of seeing a doctor shortage crisis in Korea is where these doctors are, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like Niall mentioned, like plastic surgery surgeons are obviously big in South Korea because plastic surgery is possibly, probably the number one country when it comes to plastic surgery. And so therefore, it's not going to die down anytime soon. Like Niall mentioned, it's an appealing job to have. It pays well. It doesn't need, like, usually overnight stays. So I know that many doctors would like to go into that area because it's almost a perfect job in a way. And, you know, every aspiring doctor wants to be in the best medical school. They want to be earning as much money as possible, get into a good hospital, because at the end of the day, it's also about someone's reputation as well.
The name value as well.
The name value. If you work at Yonsei Hospital, for example, that's something that in Korea we would brag about, and that's something that our parents would love to brag about if we're in that kind of hospital. But if you're in those smaller country hospitals, you tend to be a little bit more calm about it. You don't really spread it as much. You can still say you're a doctor, but I guess given the society we live in, they'll probably not be as excited if it wasn't one of those top hospitals, right? But, you know, there are also many doctors out there who just want to help people, and those people are great. The region that most doctors aspire to go to is obviously Seoul. But that would be also following the other big cities like Busan and maybe even Incheon as well. Some areas of the Gyeonggi province, which, if you don't know what the Gyeonggi province is, think of Seoul like an egg yolk, and the Gyeonggi is the white around the egg yolk, right? So it actually surrounds Seoul. So some of the cities in the Gyeonggi area are great to work at. There are some great hospitals, but there are also some not so great hospitals as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, the government argues that the further out you are of the bigger cities, the less essential medical fields that to perform surgery, and the less specialists there are in there. So therefore, the quota needs to increase. Now, the evidence to back this up, for example, there is a doctor shortage in some areas in the Gyeonggi province, what I mentioned before, and also the North Gyeongsang province. Now, for every 1,000 people, there are 1.76 and 1.39 doctors, respectively.
So that's from the chart that I showed you earlier, that Korea is at a 2-point-something, but outside of Seoul, it drops very heavily, and that's serious.
Even lower. And I would like to mention, as you mentioned before, a lot of doctors are trying to go inside the capital, obviously at high prestigious university hospitals for sure. And that really has to do with our hyper-competitive environment, especially rooting from education. And that's why the health ministry, the education ministry, lawmakers are all in this together. They're trying to find the root problem, the root solution to the problem, which is a shortage of doctors. But what is it? Would it actually be effective to expand the medical school quota that hasn't been changed since 2006? Would it be effective if we change that from 2025? This is a contentious matter, and there's so many surrounding arguments. Why don't you walk us through on what they are?
Right. I mean, you were mentioning earlier that we're a quickly aging society, so we still don't know what is yet to come. So when our generation gets older and we're still heavily focused on dermatologists and plastic surgeons, what happens when we become sick? So I really do feel like preparing ahead of time is important. And actually, 2 out of 3 Koreans are for this expansion, and most people are recognizing the lack of medical support, especially in the areas outside of Seoul and Gyeonggi. There's actually a huge lack in children's hospitals, and you know how we are always talking about why people don't want to have kids. There's lots of different areas, but also hospitals and having to wait hours on end just to get your kids in, and I think that's a huge factor as well. But there have also been cases of adults and other patients who couldn't go to emergency rooms because they had to hop from one hospital to another from the lack of medical support. And this hospital hopping, I'm going to call it, happens more often than it should. For every month, there has been about 30 cases of hospital hopping for emergency patients. And unfortunately, some even die from not being able to get the treatments on time.
Right. So I guess the common opinion among doctors, not only just doctors, but I guess the public, especially among patients, is that we do need more people, medical personnel, to solve like life and death situations, for sure. But whether this is the best solution by expanding the medical school quota is still questionable. So would you like to add another argument?
Yeah, obviously, I'll talk about the opposite argument in a minute, but just to reiterate what Niall said, as a parent as well, when you're trying to get your child into just a doctor's surgery room, or not surgery room, or just go to the doctor's, the crazy lines that you get are like 3 to 4 hours long, and your child may be very sick, and it doesn't matter where you go. I live in actually an area where it's very well known to have a good schooling system, and there are a lot of children, but the hospitals are lacking and the physicians are lacking. So that's very important. It also reminds me of another story that happened when a lady who lives in Sokcho was in labor, but there were no doctors around to help her give birth. So she actually had to get airlifted from Sokcho to Seoul just to give birth. So it's definitely a problem. However, there is always an opposite argument, and that is there are already enough doctors, according to some people, given that, and as we mentioned before, that we are becoming a super aged society, sadly. Now, some doctors, medical students, etc., don't want to be forced out into the middle of nowhere, for example, because this is what would happen if more and more doctors get pumped in. Obviously, the opportunities for some people will go out, but there is less opportunities in Seoul itself. So the less opportunities, less patients, less money after a 10-year stint of studying. I can imagine that's very disheartening. And also the national medical expenses would expect to rise as well, which might even lead to the health insurance budget to collapse.
Right, so there's just so many different angles to this story that we need to consider. But one thing that is agreeable upon all generations, depending on whether you're a doctor or a patient or a lawmaker, is that this is a problem. We are seeing some shortages in rural areas, but whether expanding the quota would be the best solution is still debatable. And it's also causing a lot of attention among young people, mainly because if we do expand this quota, it could open the gateway for young people to try to get admitted into med school again. But this time around, it would be a little easier for them to enter because of an obviously bigger quota. Now, to find out more about what young people have to say on this issue, I actually had the honor of going to Seoul National University, one of the top-ranking schools here in the country, and I talked to a few students to hear what they had to say on our discussion topic today.
I'm for this measure. We're seeing a lack of medical personnel in rural areas. More doctors are needed there.
I'm against this measure. I think it's only fair that we have a high bar for who can get into medical school. If we expand the quota, I'm worried that underqualified students will get in.
It's definitely a tricky issue. There's no guarantee expanding the medical school quota would increase the number of doctors in essential, yet relatively unpopular fields of medicine or in rural areas. The biggest problem is that we're seeing medical school students flock to the same big hospitals and high-paying departments. That's only natural and understandable.
I don't think expanding the medical school quota would directly solve the root problem. Instead, we should provide better incentives, like higher pay for doctors who decide to work at rural hospitals, or giving them better benefits.
We are definitely seeing a lack of physicians compared to the past. That's why I agree we need to find a solution to this problem. But simply expanding the quota doesn't seem the most effective. It's also worth noting how much attention this issue is getting from young people. I think it mainly has to do with how this measure widens the opportunity for young, aspiring medical school students. 8 out of 10 friends around me are thinking of taking the college entrance exam again if this measure passes.
So as you just saw, young people had relatively mixed opinions as to whether expanding the med school quota for 2025 in Korea is appropriate or not. Regardless of whether people were totally for or against this measure, though, one common opinion kept surfacing, and that mainly had to do with students empathizing that we need more doctors in rural areas and even in relatively unpopular or what are thought to be low-paying medical fields. And unpopular fields referring to pediatrics, obstetrics, or gynecology. And I would like to ask you guys heard all the street interviews that I had so far. Did anything like stick out or click with you?
I think Kim Gonu, I think he had a very valid point. While I personally agree that the expansion is necessary, I think he has a very fair point about the doctors not going to the necessary fields and that it won't solve the root issue. So there needs to be more of an incentive for these doctors who are going into these difficult fields that are on call all the time.
Exactly. I do think that was an effective solution to the problem. What about you?
For me, it was Park Hee-won, where they talked about they're worried about the underqualified students that can't go in. You know, this is a field that even though you do make mistakes, it's one of those fields where you really can't make a mistake if possible, because you're dealing with people's lives in such a delicate way. So I completely understand from that point of view.
Right, and to find out whether this is also a pressing issue abroad, we asked our viewers to share their insights. So here's what 3 of them had to say, whether they also had a physician shortage problem. Starting with Tasmia, she said, as Bangladesh is an overpopulated country, it's sad to see that we don't have enough doctors or medical services. People should encourage more young people to attend medical school. Rex said, sadly, many doctors and nurses from the Philippines are being enticed to go abroad to the U.S. or Europe. It's not a case of raising quotas for medical school to get more doctors. Black Belt said Korea has plenty of doctors. They're just all specializing in plastic surgery, so might as well incentivize other fields by subsidizing tuition in needed areas of medical study. That's a start. Now, expanding on the last comment from our viewers, what do you guys think needs to be done to see more doctors? And as we mentioned before, this seems to be the common problem. Not seeing enough at rural hospitals and in fields that are quite notorious for long hours and relatively low pay. What should be done to help more doctors go there then?
I mean, first of all, I do think that they really deserve all of our respect for being able to do this. There are other ways to earn money, this much money, and yeah, doctors do earn money, but in other ways with better lives. And so, like our comments were saying as well, we need to incentivize it in some way so that they have a better work-life balance, and maybe less so for the plastic surgeons or like the dermatologists, but in emergency rooms there needs to be maybe shorter shifts but still remain with the same pay. So I guess in a way it's a pay raise or, you know, more break hours.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before and as we saw in our viewers' comments, I think incentives are really needed in order to motivate more young doctors to try to go to these areas that need more personnel. What about you, Walter?
I think there's actually a good solution to this. Maybe we should rotate doctors. As an example, like one doctor goes in for a week and spends a week there and does his or her job, and then they go back to the city and to one of their jobs in the cities. And then obviously a constant rotation would mean that they're not going to get sick and tired of being in the country. I mean, it's not that much for a doctor to go out to a countryside for a week. I think this would reduce the stress of the long working hours or always, you know, being the one to be relied on. I think if there's a rotation, this would help a lot.
And I think these solutions will all help as officials are putting this as a priority task. We're seeing the presidential office getting involved, a lot of different officials and lawmakers even considering what to do. And we'll bring you the updates once this discussion gets further evolved. In the meantime, though, we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Nal Song,
no problem,
and Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
All right, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are News Generation.
한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?